You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 Goth Talk podcast.
When I was a baby bat, my ethos for the way that I dressed was, in a sense, to outwardly express and recognize that the world I lived in was not all roses and daisies, but there were indeed thorns. There was indeed pain and suffering, and that these things were part of life that we needed to accept and face in order to live a fulfilled life. A bit cheesy, a bit corny, I know, but for me, that was important. As I've grown older, and even on this show, we've talked about the interconnected web of organisms that all influence each other reciprocally. I've still in some way held on to that external referent that gives society the middle finger, gives toxic positivity the middle finger, and hopefully reflects on those around me the need to unpack, address, accept, and heal the pain in the world. As I grew in Goth, I often heard others talk about how Goth was such a healthy community because we didn't shy away from the full spectrum of emotion. We've talked on this podcast before about reports of higher rates of self-harm or suicide among Goths. And we've always sort of taken the stance that this disproportionate self-reporting between groups is likely due to the fact that Goths centralize an honest expression of emotion, and through that discussion are able to find a way to heal, a way to address what's going on in their life without shoving it down, repressing it, and causing bigger problems later on. So we have a bit of a different episode for you this time around on Cemetery Confessions. We're going to start off our conversation by focusing on live music and the emotionally transformative and philosophical aspect of goth and goth art. And then we're going to move on to a different topic altogether. Our guest today is Hani. I had the pleasure of meeting him face-to-face a year or so ago at a Vision video show. He's very active in the local scene and a vociferous consumer of music. For these reasons and his expertise in historical information, I wanted to have him on. And as we were discussing how we would create this episode together, my first thought was to talk about alternative culture in the Middle East and what aspects of Lebanese culture accentuate his goth identity. But Hani felt very strongly that a discussion on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict should be the focus of his interview. And I agreed. If you follow me on socials, you'll know I'm passionate about this subject. And with the platform that I have with this podcast, I believe comes some responsibility to bring to light oppression and harm being done in the world. Now, this isn't going to turn into a podcast about current events, and I will frame the discussion in more detail once we get there and its relation to goth. But I'm looking forward to seeing how this unfolds. In the past, we've had guests on to speak about areas of expertise in philosophy and sociology and subjects that aren't wholly focused on the goth experience, but part of the human experience, which of course is entangled with a goth identity. And I always enjoy these fun little experiments in learning about the world from different angles. So, as always, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. And that delightfully dark sound you hear in the background is the single This Party Ends in Tears from Male Tears off their new album Paradísco, and it also heralds the inaugural ad for Cemetery Confessions. As I mentioned, their new album, Paradísco, is going to be out July 12th, and it will be on Avant Records. Male Tears is a band I've enjoyed since their inception. Everything they've put out has been a banger, in my opinion. So I'm really looking forward to the album. Again, that will be out July 12th, and that is when streaming and physical media will be available. Just search up Male Tears or click the link in the podcast description. So with that, let's actually get into introductions. The thing I like to start the show with is to ask a little bit of background information so we can get to know you a little better. And where I like to start with that is your sort of introduction to alternative and goth culture and what that kind of journey was like for you.
I consider myself a guest in the United States. I was never born here. I didn't do school here. I arrived mid 2015, and I've been in the music scene for not that long, actually, since 2018. So I am a music enthusiast. So that kind of propelled me a lot quicker, and I discovered a lot of music in such a short time.
Yeah.
Because of the amount of shows that I go to.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's all of them, I think.
Yeah, like every other day, maybe, or every couple of days, I'd be at a show. I'm from Lebanon originally, just in the Middle East, Mediterranean country. Since arriving here, a totally different culture, totally different dynamic to how everything works. And so you get conflicted as to your identity, in a sense. Like, who am I, or what is my function in society right now? Because it's a very different society with very different goals and aspirations and everything.
Yeah.
So I started to notice certain things about Arab culture versus Western culture, and I started to compare the two, because both have pros and both have cons. Like Arab culture, cons is Eastern society, Muslim society. We would say Mina or Swana, right, as in Middle Eastern North African, or Southwest Asian North African culture, which is basically a lot of the Muslim world today. They seem to be always in your business, not much personal life going on there. It's a very gossipy, very judgy, rigorous social policing, right?
Yeah, it's very community-minded, less individualistic.
So if they see someone, quote unquote, stray, and their opinion of stray is obviously very similar to Christian, because it is an Abrahamic society, right? Yeah. With its Jews and its Muslims and its Christians.
Yeah.
If you dress in black, if you dress in leather, something's going on. Something's not right. So that's why you don't get much of a scene over there when it comes to this stuff. But they do have their positives as well. Like, there's enormous kindness. Like, they'll go out of their way to help each other out. They're very hospitable. They're very sincere. Not a lot of two-faced people going on there. On the other hand, you get Western culture, and you obviously, with its pros and cons, there's a lot of selfishness. A lot of actions are motivated by personal interests, performative justice, as long as it's not inconvenient for them, for example. Yeah. But they also have a lot of positives, like the professionalism. It's a very orderly society to a high degree. There's like law and order here. Mental health matters, is spoken about. Boundaries matter and are spoken about. So my conclusion was to try to combine whatever I could from the best of both worlds, and discard whatever it is that I don't need.
Do you feel like you've come to good place inside yourself now that feels more like you have a sense of self and purpose?
Um, Year after year, I would say it gets clearer and more crystallized.
Mm,
It's still like an ongoing journey. I don't think
mm,
I'm done. I mean, there's a lot of
yeah,
hard work to
of
do.
course. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I mean, we could talk a little about music just sort of to understand where you
Mhm.
started to get into alternative music and where
Sure.
the goth scene comes in that sense.
Okay, I'm gonna hit you with the video games right away since you brought
Okay.
that up because that's one of the biggest influences. Now, I'm assuming that I'm not sure if we're the same age, but I have a feeling we're around the same age. Maybe we both had a 90s childhood, even if we
Hmm.
were born in the 80s. Am
Yeah.
I
I'm
right? Am I
I'm
wrong?
37. Yeah.
I'm 36. So there you
Okay.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the old one. I'm 46.
Okay, you'll give us the Gen Xer perspective.
Right.
Um,
That's usually my role.
mhm. Y'all had good music, I'm gonna tell you that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so I'm gonna start out musical influences with the first stage of Contra on the NES.
Oh wow. Okay.
All right,
That's
Okay.
you
great. Yeah.
plug you plug that in, and that's your
Yeah.
musical influence right away. It's
Excellent.
solid, upbeat, action packed. There's a lot going on there, and you wouldn't expect something from like a video game back in those days, like something so catchy, right, and so
Yeah.
good
Yeah.
that to this day they probably make metal covers of it or rock covers of it.
Yeah.
Um, and
Probably some
speaking of rock,
electronic one.
yeah, yeah. Speaking of rock, you got Rockman as well,
Mm,
aka Mega Man.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I love that
that's
game.
also on the NES
And fucking hard too.
and Hard. Oh, those are pretty solid games. I mean,
Yeah.
Contra was extremely hard compared to Rockman,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it was a bit more well balanced in terms of difficulty. So difficult, but not too difficult. But you see all the metal covers that they're making of that, even though it was like an 8-bit electronic music.
Hmm.
And a lot of the games, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, it's pretty
Yeah.
much hair metal. It's glam metal, but done
Yeah.
electronically.
There's a lot of that influence. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities there.
So it was a very nerdy influence. So I consumed music passively. So I wasn't going and listening to a band as a kid, but whatever media I was consuming um, had a lot of music in it, and for me it was important. Like it set the mood, it set everything. Um, unlike um, unlike the States, in the Middle East, we leaned more towards Sega and PlayStation. So
Hmm.
Sega had a more mechanical kind of industrial sounding sound chip, as opposed to the
Right.
Super
Mhm.
Nintendo. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the game sounded more um, like games like Doom Troopers or Demolition Man or
Oh yeah.
RoboCop versus Terminator. Yeah, they all had these very hard industrial beats playing in the background. Um, and then you had some with really elaborate keyboard harmonies, minor notes, like Streets of Rage 2, for example, which I
Yeah.
believe the guys who composed it, the Japanese guys, were throwing big concerts in like Europe
Oh
where they just
really?
play. Yes, they just played music from more modern renditions of the themes from Streets of Rage or Shinobi or any of those games.
Yeah, there's a huge community in Japan specifically that plays video game music live, including some of the composers. One of my favorites was the band The Black Mages, which is Nobuo
Hmm.
Uematsu's band. That
Hmm.
plays Final Fantasy songs, but basically with rock instrumentation.
That was a big one. Even
Mhm.
these guys, I saw Nobuo live here at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. They were playing something called Symphony Fantasy or something like that. It was basically the touring orchestra for Final Fantasy.
Yeah, I've been to one of those concerts. I had a coworker whose wife was in the chorus.
Oh, wow.
and
Oh,
regularly performed with that group whenever they were touring the states.
I would see some of the rehearsals there because they were free, or whenever they had discounts for certain things, I would go see at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. It was quite pricey, and I can't say that I fit in too much over there. Especially back then, I was still in my grunge era.
Mm.
So, but the sounds in the hall, it just sounds so pure. The instruments sound so pure and so clear that you really enjoy it. It's like therapeutic.
Yeah, symphony orchestra sounds
Yeah.
can probably give you a little bit of flashbacks of Middle Eastern communities, very gossipy and judgy of people who don't quote unquote belong. Uh,
Exactly.
but it's definitely a different crowd at some of the video game concerts or some of the more pops type concerts too, rather than a standard orchestral performance.
I think
Yes.
most things are better orchestral though. Like a few years ago they did the VNV Nation and Blue Dangle and Combi Christ and these industrial bands did orchestral versions of some of their music. And for me, that fits in beautifully with my sort of romantic goth tendencies, but also just I love the fact that so many goths are nerds, and I can have all kinds of conversations about video games and anime and all these sort of nerdy pastimes
Yeah, it
in the
was. I
scene.
think people underestimate video game music.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
like
yeah.
a lot of that stuff was really in good tastes. I remember the Mortal Kombat 3 from the arcades or all of that stuff. It was really good music. So a lot of the my musical taste does come from these older consoles, and then as time went on, we moved to PlayStation, and you had more elaborate stuff like Metal Gear Solid One. Very dark, atmospheric, kind of like espionage. It sort of reminded me of and also the Trees, the band. They have that album, the Klaxon, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's the exact
Oh, wow. I'll have
same
to go listen to those
atmosphere.
together. Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. Listen to that back to back. It's really, really
Yeah.
interesting. Resident Evil 2, you had, ambient horror, with piano and violin.
Hmm.
Silent Hill 1 is industrial music, like good old fashioned industrial music, just like banging on steel.
Yeah,
A
that's
lot of that
right.
stuff
Yeah.
came from there. So what else was happening in the 90s? Michael Jackson was happening.
Hmm.
I remember when I was a kid, there was a lot of VHS tapes, Michael Jackson, just his music videos and stuff. My sister was in love with him. Wrestling was big.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the wrestler. See, I'm mentioning the stuff you like. I know you're a fan. I know you're a fan. But yeah, the theme songs for the wrestlers, we could talk about that. Like even the retro sounding one, like the '80s retro sound, like Jake the Snake's intro, or 1, 2, 3 Kids intro, or Bret Hart, a
Yeah.
little bit more guitar. Um,
Yeah.
and some of that got a little bit more moody and dark, like Undertaker's Ministry theme. Stone
Yeah,
Cold,
that's right.
basically, glass samples and the sirens in the background, all of that.
Yeah.
I don't know
Oh,
anything.
wow. That's
What
wild.
what
Yeah.
what what wrestling themes caught your attention from back in those days?
Well, I only started watching wrestling recently, so I don't have a lot of
Mhm.
good reference. Like, obviously, I've heard the Undertaker's stuff and Stone Cold, and Jake the Snake is a good shout because he had this very like synth pop kind of industrial entrance. But yeah, also like The Brood, which was completely a ripoff of Vampire the Masquerade. You had Edge and Gangrel and Christian, and that was like that was fantastic. That was very gothic and very of the time. Kane had a very moody, spooky, like organ sort of entrance, like coming out of hell kind of thing. Obviously, I had seen The Undertaker in coffins and on this big gothic throne and coming back to life. But visually, kind of everybody recognized. So even though I didn't watch wrestling, I knew who these people were, and visually they were very recognizable because I mean they were cultural icons. They weren't just a sort of niche thing. Everybody knew about these people. those were obviously The Undertaker was like the main guy that I was into, even though I didn't watch. But a lot of that aesthetic reference leaked through as well, like the Road Warriors, even if you want to go with the more Mad Max kind of vibe, but still had some of that dark gothic feel to it. A lot of that stuff was pretty prevalent. Silent Hill, I didn't play Silent Hill 1. Silent Hill 2, though, was my jam.
I have the first three on vinyl because honestly, those three on vinyl are a must-have. The first three Silent Hills. The first one being the most satanic, most purely industrial sounding one out of the three. Definitely worth it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go.
Very noisy.
Listen back to that.
Oh well, MTV was on the whole time. Whatever was popular on MTV at the time is what we consumed. So whatever was played, Nirvana, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Limp Bizkit, Eminem, Evanescence, Cranberries. I could never hate some of those, even though some of them are currently memes. Some of these bands have been reduced to memes, but it's just a part of it is nostalgia.
And so then, I guess jumping forward, what was your introduction to goth bands? Where did that come in?
Well, I tried to figure it out because I asked myself that question once, and I think when I first started to listen to actual bands actively and seriously, not just consuming it through media or through anime or through whatever.
Right.
I was like, when did I get into goth? And I guess what I did at the time was whatever I liked, I would save it on a playlist on YouTube. I have these like playlists and I save everything there on YouTube. I don't use Spotify to this day or any of the other stuff.
Yeah.
So I went back and I started to track down when is it that I started introducing goth to my music, because it was mostly, when I first started listening, it was mostly punk rock and grunge.
Okay.
I started to find that there is some Cure songs here and there, some Bauhaus here and there, and some Susie here and there, even though I had no clue what goth was or that these songs were goth. I must have stumbled across them, must have listened, must have liked it, and added it.
I know Smashing Pumpkins has name checked Bauhaus on occasion, so I don't know if that might have been one potential.
My Chemical Romance did as well.
Funny. Yeah, there was no My Chemical. There was no My Chemical Romance. I don't think I had an emo phase at all.
Well, you don't like real punk rock music?
Well, yeah, I guess not. But I mean, it made sense because most of what I was listening to at the time, a lot of it was a bit sad. But it wasn't emo. It was like grunge was a lot of my sad music, and like Soundgarden and things like that. Chris Cornell is my favorite vocalist, to this day. But yeah, I guess post-punk made its way, kind of on the same theme, but technically like very different. And yeah, post-punk later led to goth music. I remember the first goth event I went to was Nocturna, because I didn't know where to start.
Yeah,
I had no clue where to start. And I think when you Google goth events, when you Google goth events, maybe that's the first thing that pops up. I don't know. It's definitely the biggest thing here in Chicago as far as goth events.
Probably is the biggest thing you're going to find if you're just looking up goth events in Chicagoland area.
Yeah, those keywords are taken, copyrighted by Sarah, I suppose, at this point. So I walked in as a metalhead, punk guy into this goth club, and I'm like, what do you do? I mean, it was kind of empty-ish. I think I might have showed up on time because it usually fills up a couple of hours in, and it definitely wasn't one of the crowded ones. Like it wasn't the Halloween one, and it wasn't the Valentine's one. It was one of the lighter attended ones. And I didn't know how to dance. All I knew was how to headbang at the time. So, well, I guess what played in my favor was I really liked the music. So I had that appetite for that style of music.
Mhm.
And so I started to sway. And then the lights were really dim. So no one could really see what you're doing. And then I found
Mhm.
out that goths don't even know how to dance. They're just doing whatever.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, that worked out.
Yeah, I certainly don't know how to dance. Trey might be the exception to the rule.
I have done some actual formal dance training, but it is mostly in modern and interpretive dance, which is oftentimes portrayed as just doing whatever the fuck you want. So,
Yeah.
but it is very interpretive, very expressive. It's not about, and I also disagree with the concept of dance being about learning special moves.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do that, you basically just start dancing the same to every song, and you're not actually expressing
Right.
anything anymore. You're just, oh, this is my dance move, so I do my dance move when the music
Right.
plays. And the only difference is maybe how fast you do it, if you pay attention to rhythm at all.
Mm.
So, no, I view
How old
dance
were
as
you
very
when you did
abstract.
dance classes?
I was college actually.
Oh,
I took
okay.
modern dance in college.
Oh,
I don't know
wow.
why I didn't know that.
Only one class, but it
Okay.
was something I did. I took some other stuff here and there, community classes, small drop-in things for swing, tango,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of kind of hip hop urban styles.
Mm-hmm.
And then I go to enough dance events all the time that I just have been
Right. Yeah.
inundated in that as a style of expression. So I've definitely, most of what I've picked up has been not formally trained. It's been by observing and emulating
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and practicing
I think
after
that's how the
years and
goth club
years and
worked.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I learned, that's how I got into dance at the clubs is, kind of like you were saying, Hani, I just go and don't know what's going on and I just watch. And then, like you said, you realize people can't really see that well. So you just start playing with things and
Mm.
you either fall into it or you don't. Some people just aren't interested in the dancing thing. I happen to be very interested in the dancing thing.
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I mean, it sounds like it because you seem to have a really keen interest on like enrolling in the classes and learning about different dance styles and like when I go to these clubs, I think the first time I ever thought about dancing was when I saw what's his name, Scott Weiland, um, when in his glam god era, he was pulling these sick dance moves and he was like
Mm-hmm.
unstoppable on stage, even though his life was falling apart. Um, but I was like, wow, this guy has some moves on him. He looks pretty cool on stage. But yeah, when you walk into a goth club, you could kind of see, like, you could class people right away as like, okay, there's the most of the crowd that are doing okay. Um, then there's people who are like timid and barely swaying left and right. And then you see a few people that really stand out. Like these guys are like, they're on fire, like really dancing really well. And you're like, how do I get this good? And I asked one of them, like my buddy Adrian, I
Oh
asked,
yeah.
I was like, how do you get this good? And he's like, well, I dance in the shower. So, so there you
Mm-hmm.
go.
Yeah.
I mean, the way I've always viewed it is dance is simply intentional movement. So I'm dancing all the time because I don't sort of let my body go on autopilot. If
Uh,
I'm just walking down the street or moving around, I'm thinking about how I'm doing it.
mm-hmm.
So it is a form of practice at all
How
times.
Judith Butlerian of you. Um, yeah. I mean, you have an incredible depth of music knowledge, and you, as you said, you go out a lot. So there's a lot there that we could talk about.
But yeah, I do feel like I spread myself too thin, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I wish that I was focused on one genre because I would know more about it. Um,
Yeah.
but I guess,
Oh,
Well,
I feel
yeah,
that.
that's the plight
yeah,
of the music fan, I think.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we were preparing for this episode, though, we sort of decided that what we wanted to start with, because who knows how much time we have, was talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I want to sort of spend a couple minutes making sort of a framework around why we're talking about this on a goth podcast. We don't usually do stuff about current events and that kind of thing. And so I wanted to sort of contextualize this, at least for the way that I view things, as the podcast and as my own perspective. First of all, I think that current events and politics and subculture, like Goth, as much as some Goths try to distance themselves from that, the two they intersect, they're intertwined. And I've been thinking about the question recently a lot around, like, how is Goth political? How is it political? Is the personal political? Trey sent me this video recently about achievement culture. And one of the points in that video was that the way that we spend our leisure time is political. Because if you think about who gets time to enjoy themselves and follow their passions and be contemplative, it's usually not the working class, because of the energy required to survive in a capitalist system, and other important factors like working class people usually live near highways or airports or industrial sites, or they're being bombed. And so quiet as a concept is a luxury usually for the wealthy. So when we make a choice that's fairly simple, like to go out with friends, to go to a club, to go to a concert, instead of alternatively maybe passively scrolling through social media, or spending your energy to generate wealth for your boss or something like that, that itself is political. So for example, Goths often share spaces with queer communities. And so you can point to things like the Pulse nightclub shooting, which is entangled with the act of going out to an event. I know that kind of thing is in the back of my mind a lot of times when I'm going out to events. And so in a way, these are political acts. And you can talk about like how queer bodies are political and Black bodies are political, but also I think community and creating art and how you create art is also political, which to me means this is relevant to Goth. Another example that always stands out to me is this sort of ethos in Goth of rebelling against toxic positivity. I think that's political, because you always hear this sort of like, if you want to live a full life, you need to experience the full range of emotions and not gloss over aspects of existence with this kind of toxic positivity. Because toxic positivity can also mean letting those in power evade responsibility or ignoring harm that's inflicted on minorities so you can keep a positive attitude. So yeah, I think it's psychological and philosophical, but also political, because our emotions shape our beliefs in some way. Our emotions shape how we are treated under the law. To relate it back to the Palestinian and Gazan thing we're going to talk about, I saw recently somebody talking about this idea of the problem of the perfect Palestinian, where essentially as soon as they express an anger or protest in response to being dehumanized, it reinforces the stereotype of Arabs as violent or dangerous, right? There's the racist stereotype of the mad Black woman, that kind of thing. So emotions and expressing emotion is political in itself, and our bodies are political. Our emotions are embodied and they're in relationship with other people. And as this whole thing has been unfolding the last few months, I know I've run into Goths who have these weirdly conservative or bigoted views that kind of take me off guard. And there's unfortunately been a contingent of Goths who are taking a pro-Zionism, pro-colonialism stance, which is really upsetting, but just shows that like, just because we're in a subculture doesn't mean we exist outside of the realm of the environment that we're in. So actually, I just saw somebody posted about I believe it was in saying something about being anti-vax, and that was a whole other thing. Like when we were trying to get people to stay home. I know I'm rambling. Sorry, I'll stop talking in a second. when we get people we were trying to like stay home, get vaccines, wear masks. And then you had these bands in the scene, industrial scene, goth scene, that are like, just bringing up these conspiracy theory, anti-vax points. That all impacts us as a community. So I just wanted to explain that in a sort of, my perspective at least, in a broader context, because I know people get pissy about like, why are you talking about this? This isn't a news channel or whatever.
I mean, there's no way we can talk about this without pissing people off.
That's true.
That's
and
just
that's fine
the
with
nature
me.
of things.
That's fine with me.
Even beyond the I don't want to talk politics thing, we will piss people
Sure.
off just by discussing this. It's not an easy topic.
Yeah.
There is no good position to take.
This makes it more enjoyable for me. But I'll tell you what, though. As far as the goth, you did mention toxic positivity and things like that. I do agree with you. Part of the appeal to goth was kind of a mechanism for me, because I was really, really sad. Because of life in general.
Yeah.
And so goth was a system that helped me organize and process the thoughts and cope with the sadness. It's like you embrace that part of you, and you're basically sipping life's misery as if it's wine. Basically, you're enjoying a little bit of that bitterness there.
I love that.
So you didn't get that with a lot of other music genres.
Mm-hmm.
And also really good music. So
here you go. That does help. Yeah, no, I like that because I do think, of course, there's a lot of conversation about music and what goth is and that kind of thing. But I think it's important to recognize that there is a profound existential aspect to goth that informs the way that you act in the world and perceive the world. And I think that's very important to kind of explore and talk about that. But I want to talk about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. My intuition initially was to just start by talking about what's happening currently, but obviously I know this is wrapped up in a lot of historical context. So I'll maybe defer to you as to where the best place to start with that is.
Okay. First things first, for me to talk about this, anybody who's listening is probably wondering, why is this guy talking about it? Who is this guy to even talk about it? I have lived my life in the Middle East, the majority of it, about 26, 27 years. I am Arab and I am also part Jewish. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Which we'll talk about DNA maybe a little bit later on, because it's an important topic to talk about. It's not a strange thing for somebody from my country to be part Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And I have lived through multiple wars, not as a combatant, of course.
Yeah.
But as a civilian, one of which, the biggest one of which actually, was the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon.
Oh, yeah.
Where I was in the capital as it was being bombed.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
By planes probably funded by the United States.
Yeah.
But it was interesting, actually, because I remember the day before, I was supposed to go and apply for, what do you call it? The TOEFL exam, which is like an English proficiency exam.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was trying to enroll in a university, in a school. And so they had it as a requirement because it was an American university. And I was calling the center. I'm like, hey, my appointment is tomorrow, but there seems to be a war's about to start. Do I still show up?
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, your appointment's still happening. So
wow.
I go down to the capital of Beirut, which is being actively bombed at the time. And I go to the center, and lo and behold, the door is closed. Nobody's there. So I guess that appointment was canceled.
Great.
How nice of him to let you know.
Yeah. It was really kind of him. I am from that region, and I am a product of that region to a big extent. And I am now here in the States, and in the scene, very well connected now, with a lot of friends, and so uh, I feel alternative than CNN,
Mm-hmm.
or Fox, or Fox was coming. We got to be balanced here, right?
Fair and balanced. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you get something from somebody at least who was on the ground,
Yeah.
um, rather than just the people living here,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
just debating back and forth about it.
Right.
And yeah, the point you made about the historicity of it, I do come from a historian's background. Um, I authored a book, in that regard, but it was not a book about modern Arab history. So no part of it was about Palestine or Israel or what is happening. This is not my area of expertise, but it was more about like ancient tribal Arab politics, like 1400 years ago.
Oh, wow. Very
So I
interesting.
do appreciate though the history. I do appreciate the history, um, of any topic. I feel to understand anything, you really need a good historical background and definitions,
Mm-hmm.
which is something that I probably would love to start with, is definition. Like who is an Arab and who is a Jew and where do they come from,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what are they exactly fighting over?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of thing that I feel more benefit listeners,
Yeah, it would be great. I'd
rather
love for you to
than
talk about that.
yeah yeah I'm not I was never a fan of emotional, um, appeals, as emotional
Sure.
as the situation is. Like it's pretty bad that I do cry about it
Yeah.
almost every other day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
I always feel like I can provide a more academic truth, grounded in evidence,
Right.
rather than link people to 50 TikTok videos or 50 blah 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 videos where they're seeing kids,
Oh
crying their
no.
eyes out,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
kids with no shoes. We all see what's happening. I don't think you
Yeah.
even need me to explain that.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure what you think of that, idea.
I mean, obviously, I know some of the broad strokes, but it would be, I think, like you said, very beneficial to everyone to get a historical perspective, because as modern as the conflict is now, the roots of where that comes from are very important. And yeah, so if you want to talk about that, I'd love to give you the space for that.
Let's start with Arabs. Arabs and Jews are both Semitic people. They speak the Semitic languages. The Arabs originally, there's two major types of Arabs. The original Arabs are from Yemen, the country that's starving right now in famine and not doing well.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the Arabs originate from. They're from Yemen. Later, they spread across the Arabian Peninsula, which is what you know today as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and
Mm-hmm.
UAE and all of that. The other type of Arab, other than these original Arabs, because the Arab world now is vast. A
Yeah.
lot of it is in North Africa, in fact. So how is it that these people are Arab, you ask? So they are people that identify as Arabs from like a national identity point of view,
Mm-hmm.
mainly related to society's official language around them. A lot of them are in the Levant, which is Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and Cyprus.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them are in North Africa. They're not necessarily ethnically Arab. Okay, so they're not necessarily descendants of those Yemeni Arab tribes, but a lot of them have intermarried with the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula. So
Mm-hmm.
they do have like actual Arab blood in them, regardless. Um, so that's what composes the Arab world now. There was also Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, like the tribe of Najjar or Quraidha or Auf or Nadir. These are all Jewish tribes that are in Arabia. But it also goes without saying that this person needs to identify as an Arab,
Right.
because like Arab countries are culturally diverse. There's Assyrians there's Chaldeans, there's Kurds, there's Jews, there's Armenians, there's Berber, there's Amazigh. A lot of them speak Arabic, but they don't necessarily identify as Arab. It is a very diverse culture, the Arabs in the Middle East.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the Jews, I mean, there's two origins for the Jews. There's the biblical story, which says that they're like descendants of Abraham, and Abraham lived beyond the Euphrates River, right? So basically near the border of Iran today. So that's the origin of the Jews according to the Bible, because they're all descendants of Abraham.
Right, yeah.
And then God instructed him to move to the land of Canaan, where there were already a lot of people living there. Okay. And he had a grandson called Jacob, and his nickname was Israel. So that's the origin of the word Israel. That was a nickname of basically, or a label for Jacob. And then, the story that they went to Egypt and then they came back to escape the pharaohs.
Right.
But all of the story is biblical mythology. None of that is accurate. What is historically accurate, according to historians, is that the Jews are actually Canaanites. They're an offshoot of the Canaanites who lived in that region. They couldn't have escaped Pharaoh because Egypt was ruling the land that we call today Palestine / Israel. It was actually under Egyptian dynasty at the time.
Okay.
So they were ruling it. So they weren't really escaping anywhere if they went to the land of Canaan.
Right.
Historically speaking, they were Canaanites. Canaanites were a polytheistic society. They worshipped many gods and goddesses. There was no monotheism at the time. It was just pantheons, hierarchies. At one point, the Jews started to distinguish themselves from the other Canaanite people by exclusively worshiping Yahweh, right? Because Yahweh in the Canaanite canon and all of that, he had a father called El. He had a wife, right? And it was like a very polytheistic imagination of gods back then. And then, they devoted themselves to Yahweh, and at one point, they even triumphed. They became like a dominant force. They established two kingdoms, which is Israel in the north and Judea in the south, right? Israel did not encompass modern-day Israel, and Judea did not also encompass modern-day Israel. And both of those kingdoms, which were Jewish, were at war with each other. They weren't friends. So the origins are very different.
Yeah.
Than the very picture perfect propaganda that you could get from, for example, from an Israeli politician, like, oh yeah, God gave us the land and we established a kingdom there, and it was this and that. And in fact, there were other kingdoms over there, and there were a lot of other people, and it was never 100% Jewish at any point. There was all of these different people living there at all times. It was never 100% Muslim. It was never 100% Jewish. It was never 100% Christian, because the Christians ruled it during the Crusades. The Muslims ruled it probably the longest time, and it was still never 100% Muslim. There was still a sizable Christian population there, like maybe 36% or so Christian. There was always maybe about 10% Jewish population in that area. On top of like the other ethnicities also that thrive there. So that already you can sense that there's a big hole in the narrative, in the biblical narrative, that this is
you have to justify an ethno-state somehow.
Yeah. And then there comes Zionism, basically. Zionism in itself, it was many different types, many different ideologies. They weren't all in agreement on one thing. Some of them just wanted a Jewish homeland. That doesn't mean that they owned or controlled or ruled the country. It was just a homeland, like somewhere where they can call home and be, let's say, safe. Some of them wanted, later on, a two-state deal, split it between the Arabs and the Jews. Some of them wanted a secular state, like let's say like Germany, but just in the Middle East, where everybody has rights and they have security and all of that. And some of them wanted to go and occupy the whole thing and turn it into a Jewish ethno-state. And these are obviously the most extreme views tend to win out a lot of the time because you can imagine more fiery speeches, more emotional speeches, more religious speeches.
Also, the ones willing to take the most extreme actions to get what they want.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, even the approaches, as you said, some were very diplomatic, were very cautious because they understood, that the land was under like a British mandate and Arabs were a majority. And so they would try to pacify the Arabs as they slowly, for example, took chunks of the land little by little. And some of the Zionist extremists had a more direct, provocative approach where they would like train and smuggle European weapons. And they often would clash with their Arab neighbors and vice versa. The Arabs would clash with them as well. And then you have Christian Zionism, which is here.
Yeah.
Not exclusively here, but a lot of it is here. And these guys are just they're basically evangelicals that support the nation of Israel to initiate the end of times and the second coming of Jesus. I'm not going to talk much about these guys because it's as silly as it sounds.
Yeah. I mean,
these guys.
that's what I grew up in. And this kind of like worship of Jerusalem, both out of the biblical ideal of them, of that being God's chosen people, and also just a fear of the apocalypse in Revelations, talking about if Jerusalem falls, then Armageddon begins, the end times begin. So there's this vested interest in keeping control over that region in the hands of Israel, and you conflate that with this righteous whatever, I can't think of the word, but this holy sort of evocation, and tie all that together, and it's a pretty potent combination. And unfortunately, those were the churches that I grew up in. So kind of pretty. I know how fucked up it is.
Christian Zionists do not really actually like Jewish people, nor do they like the Arabs.
Yeah.
But they're in it for very biblical
selfish
reasons.
Yeah.
It's to do with their own faith. They couldn't care less. That is good to know. So yeah. So who has the right then over this land? You have Arabs there, and you have the Jews there. So who has the right? And does it make sense to reduce it to Arab versus Jew when the land originally was Canaanites, and there was Aramites, and there was Jebusites, and there was Moabites? And what happened to those people? All those people, did they just vanish? What you conclude from that, and I did mention DNA, and this is where we're supposed to go back to the DNA. So the Zionist propaganda at this point is that Palestinians are Arabs that came from the Arabian Peninsula and took over that land. Okay? That's not what the DNA says. The DNA says our Palestinians are actually descendants of the ancient people of Canaan. In fact, I'm Lebanese, and according to the DNA test, I was 60% Canaanite.
Oh, wow.
So, and as you know, Canaanites are people who predated even the kingdom of Israel.
Yeah.
So they were the original inhabitants of that land when little was even known about that land. And so the people who came from Europe, the Zionists who came from Europe in the early 1900s and took over and said, hey, this belongs to us. It was given to us by God. They identify as the Jews, which is true. And they say they have historical ties to the land, which is true. But having historical ties to a land doesn't mean that you own it.
Yeah.
Or you currently own it. So let's say I had done my DNA test, and instead of it saying 60% Canaanite, let's say it said I was 45% Romanian. I can claim a historical tie to that land, right? Because I'm 45% Romanian.
Yeah.
What I can't do is go over there right now and claim a village.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Right? That's literally all it is. It's as simple as this.
Yeah.
So the Ashkenazi in Eastern Europe are Jewish people we don't believe in the conspiracy. I personally don't believe in that conspiracy theory that there's like, oh, they're claimants to Judaism and this and that. No, they're Jewish people. And the DNA tests prove it. So there's two studies that I'm going to talk about real quick.
Mm-hmm.
One is quite recent from 2020. It was titled The Genomic History of the Bronze Age Southern Levant, which is current day Israel, Palestine, by the way. Okay. And that DNA study illustrates that Palestinian DNA is deeply rooted to the ancient people of the Southern Levant who lived there in the Bronze Age.
Mm.
Now, the Kingdom of Israel is Iron Age.
Yeah.
Okay. So it predates. So when you're coming from Europe and you're kicking these people out, you're kicking out indigenous people, according to science, because we're not going to disagree with the numbers. And these studies were obviously not done by Muslims. In fact, a lot of the DNA studies were done by Jewish people. And this study also shows that Ashkenazi, 50% European component in their DNA.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Which is pretty important.
Yeah.
Because they intermarried. They lived there. They intermarried there. Nothing too wild about that. Which is why I wasn't dumbfounded when I found out that I was part Jewish also in the DNA test. Because that's a land where Jewish people lived.
Yeah.
Right? And also Persians and also Turks.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have a blend of all of that in you. They do say, as well as the European-related component, for the average Jewish person living in the East, it's 8.7%, like the Mizrahi Jews and the Sephardic Jews that are living in the Middle East that were Eastern Jews, basically. They have an 8.7% European Jewish DNA. They study the phenotypes and things like that.
Right, okay.
But the Ashkenazi have 41% in this study. In another study, it was closer to 50. A difference between the Eastern Jew and the Ashkenazi coming from Europe. Now, who colonized Palestine? That's the biggest problem. It was the Ashkenazi. And the Ashkenazi, when they came from Europe to Palestine, in the eyes of the indigenous population, they appeared to them as white people. They dressed like white people. They spoke white people language because a lot of them were from Poland, from Russia, from Germany. They used like European weapons. So everything about them to the indigenous people seemed as no difference than the British who colonized them at the time.
Yeah.
Who were mandating, Palestine, or who were occupying Palestine at the time. We can ask like what pushed these Jewish people to immigrate from Europe. And that's also really important to know is Europe had pogroms. In Eastern Europe, there were pogroms. They were the overzealous Christians were attacking Jewish ethnicities. Mm-hmm. They wanted to get rid of them. And so the Jewish people there weren't feeling exactly at home. And so that's where the idea of Zionism started, that we need to find our own homeland. And there was a split. A lot of the Jewish people were deeply rooted because they've been living there for centuries, for millennia, even some. And they didn't want to move to the Middle East, to a desert. Well, a lot of others decided that it was time to move out of Europe and try to create a homeland. Of course, when they arrived, there were already people there, and that's the background of the conflict.
Well, okay, so actually, Trey, do you have anything you wanted to bring up?
The only thing I wanted to mention was something that I learned as I was sort of looking into this is the origin of the Palestinian national, or at least what I read about the origin of the Palestinian national identity, because there's lots of claims, Palestine doesn't exist. There's no national identity. It's a region and it's a bunch of disparate people and all that. From what I saw, it seems that the Palestinian national identity was formed while under the Ottoman Empire as almost a reaction against Turkish control over the Palestinian region. There was a lot of control coming from, the Central Ottoman Empire, and some Turkish nationalism was coming in. And the people of Palestine were seeing other nations, and this is like in the late 19th century. So a bit before the first for the First World War, um, and it sort of came to a head around the First World War, and that's also part of what got both Britain and France involved in that region heavily as well. Is that as this Palestinian identity, this national identity, was coming forth and sort of pushing back against the Ottomans, as World War One was starting to arise, the Palestinians were viewing that as an opportunity, and they, as were the British. And so the British were doing what a lot of colonializing powers do: find an element in a nation that they'd like to have more control over, that they can help support to free themselves, supply them, train them, have them fight against a mutual enemy in exchange for some potential benefits. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's how the British sort of got a foothold into that region that became the British Protectorate of Palestine, by leveraging the Palestinians who wanted their independence. The British promised everybody a little piece of the action in the end, and that that caused the divisions with the Sykes-Picot division of the area, arbitrary division of region that has nothing to do with the people who actually live there and what their views and beliefs and what they feel like they're a part of don't matter. But I just thought that was interesting, that the Palestinian identity stemmed from, rubbing under the yoke of the Ottoman Empire.
The British were in a predicament during the World War, and they wanted as much help as they can get. Mm-hmm. So the Ottomans were on the opposite camp. Okay, they were enemies of the British, and the Ottomans weren't even doing that well.
Yeah.
So the British sought the aid of the Arabs to overthrow the Ottomans, the Turks. Mm-hmm. And the Arabs needed some reassurances, because for them, the Ottoman Sultanate, it wasn't too bad, right? Because they were Muslims, which kind of fits in with the vast majority of the people there's religious views. Mm-hmm. And the Turks are from the region. They're from the Middle East, right? And that Sultanate has been ruling for a few hundred years. So for them, they needed some reassurances, as if we get rid of these guys for you, we obviously want something better, right? We're trying to progress, not regress. So can we have autonomy over our own lands? Because these are Arab lands. The overwhelming majority of lands in the area are owned by Arabs. Can we rule our own lands? And so the British made that promise that, yes, we'll give you your rulership over your own lands. Just help us overthrow these guys. And they also sought the help of the Jewish people. And they promised them the same piece of land that they promised the Arabs as well. And they sought the help of the French. And they also promised them that, hey, you get a piece of the cake. Mm-hmm. After we vanquish our enemies, we're going to split this into multiple, territories. And the Brits are going to have some. The French are going to have some. They promised the Jewish people homeland. And they promised the Arabs to rule their own lands. Fast forward, obviously the Arabs were screwed over because they didn't get that land. Syria was, and Lebanon were like under the French. Palestine, Jordan were under the English. And then the mandate lasted for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't relinquish. Whenever these colonial powers take over a piece of land, and they'll use this rhetoric with the people. They'll use these kind of tactics and tell them, hey, we're preparing you for independence.
Yeah.
But they never really do. Independence ultimately happens after bloodshed. Yeah. Just like what happened in Algeria with the French and whatnot. They only got their independence after bloodshed. So we're preparing you, like we're your training wheels, we're civilizing you and all of that stuff. Is very common colonial tactic. Yeah. So the Arabs, the moment the Ottomans collapsed, the Arabs automatically wanted to create a state, right? Mm-hmm. And that state would have been Palestine there, just like it was Lebanon, just up north. And it was Syria, northeast of them, and it was Jordan. They were all under mandate. Nationalism is not an Arab thing. It's foreign to Arabs. We were always ruled by empires. It was always empires, caliphates, sultanates. A vast thing. There wasn't like a small country here and a small country next to it with this border in between them. That's a very European, foreign idea that was introduced when the colonizers kind of like split the cake after they occupied the region. Right? So it makes sense that there was no national identity. They developed it. The Arabs developed it quite quickly, but not quick enough. Not quick enough. And so the Arabs who were in Palestine, which Palestine is an actual entity because the English were mandating over Palestine. So it's a thing. It exists. Now, whenever the Arabs of that land, of Palestine, whenever they wanted to establish a state, the British would stop them. This was at the very, very beginning, for colonial reasons. But after a few decades, and after wave after wave of Jewish immigration from Europe, the Arabs realized that there was also a plan to create a Jewish ethno-state and take over their part, or part of their country or all of their country. And so they made more attempts to establish. At that point, they were ready, and the English didn't have too many excuses as to why the Arabs couldn't have a state. But the state was delayed because the people who were in charge of that piece of land were the likes of Chaim Weizmann in Britain, who was a Zionist,
okay,
among other Zionists. So they were rejecting and refusing that the Arabs are able to rule because they were buying time and stalling. Buying time and stalling for what? For more Jewish immigration. So the higher the percentage of Jewish people, the more they're going to get a bigger piece of the cake to create an ethno-state.
Yeah. That's around, I'm thinking, around when the Nakba happened?
And Nakba was later on. Nakba was when it all came to the violent conclusion where they actually just kicked them out. Because when the Nakba happened, which is like in the later 40s, in the late 40s, still at that point, Jewish people only owned about 6% of the land.
Wow.
But they had a lot more weapons. Yeah. They were better organized. They were better trained. The Arabs were peasants. They were farmers. In means of weapons, they were all just riding donkeys, maybe with swords and these rifles that take like 5 minutes to reload.
Yeah.
That wasn't going to do anything against like a Gatling gun that they could have gotten from Europe.
Yeah.
Or sniper rifles, or that wasn't going to do anything about it. So they easily were able to overcome the Arabs at the time and kick them all out. So yeah, the Arabs that left during the Nakba left either due to violence directly or due to fear of violence, because they saw what happened to the nearby villages. Some villages were decimated. There was massacres in Deir Yassin and this and there. They were like, we don't want this to happen to us. Let's get out of here before this happens to us. All of them assuming that they would leave and then later come back, but they never did come back. So yeah, it's pretty depressing.
Yeah,
I wanted to get the DNA part out of the way because that's a little bit of a boring part, but it kind of sheds some light on kind of like more of the demographic. I was just talking about demographics there.
Yeah, it's very important, I think, because like I've seen Zionists get angry when somebody mentions there are like Arab Jews, because it kind of relies on this idea that they're two different entities, because they at least as I understand Zionism today, they hate Arabs. They perpetuate the stereotype of Arabs as dangerous. And when you start talking about how these people were coexisting and they were sharing practices and these kinds of things, it sort of dissolves that clean delineation that you need to believe in an ethno-state or something like that.
Yeah, that's always a major strategy, right? Is to make the enemy such an other that you can do anything to them. It doesn't really matter. They can't be considered human. They can't be considered a valuable member of a community, because if you have an enemy that is viewed that way, you cannot do inhumane things anymore. You view them as a person. You view them with empathy.
Yeah.
So that's almost always one of the very first tactics in any given war, is to turn the opposition into other than human.
Abjectification was the word I heard. Removing personhood and nuance. Yeah, expelling them from the realm of the human. And that's kind of going back to Zionism. What bothered me so much about hearing Goths sort of espouse that kind of propaganda is because, at least on a superficial level, I think Goths have had some taste of what it's like to be stereotyped and mistreated for dumb reasons, superficial reasons. And I'd like to think that we're sensitive to that kind of rhetoric and can spot that that was especially prevalent after like 9/11, right? Evoking that fear of the other being dangerous. So oppressing a minority group, I would think Goths would want to stand against that, whether it's Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or whatever. And I think the issue I've seen is Zionism now, which is essentially, as I understand it, basically a political movement to just take this land and displace everyone else. There's this kind of propaganda of tying that into Judaism and sort of abusing religion to justify the crimes that they're committing, the war crimes and all these things. And even though, so the propaganda works of like, if you speak against Zionism, then you're anti-Semitic. But there are most like Orthodox Jews are anti-Zionists. There's plenty of anti-fascist Jewish organizations that are anti-Zionist. They're basically like the very simple idea of Goth saying, oh, I was bullied, why would I bully someone else? Same sort of idea. How would we perpetuate oppression that we ourselves experienced? I would want to make clear that obviously anti-Semitism is bigotry and has no place in general, and that Zionism is a separate political movement from Judaism. It just seems some people have a difficult time understanding that you can criticize government and the state and people in power that are trying to justify murdering 40,000 people or whatever the number is now. I haven't checked recently, but like that, destroying their homes and perpetuating this trauma, this ethnic cleansing. I think you can criticize that, and it seems a bit ridiculous to say that's anti-Semitic. But that's, like you were both saying, that's the rhetoric that has to exist. Zionism has to believe that Arabs or Palestinians will always hate Jews, and so this is the only option. It doesn't help that, people like Netanyahu is basically a Holocaust revisionist that basically blamed the Holocaust on the Grand Mufti, that Hitler didn't want to exterminate the Jews. He just wanted to expel the Jews. And then, it's all this historical revisionism and blatant racism that is used to get away with these war crimes. And obviously, like you said, the financial support from America as wanting to keep this sort of foothold in that region and looking the other way on these things is also obviously part of that.
One thing I wanted to mention in light of your comment about that sort of empathy of an oppressed minority for other oppressed minorities, that makes it not quite as cut and dried as I think you laid it out, as far as the Zionist versus as far as the support in this idea, is the fact that Zionism in its core, at its root, at its start, was a reaction of a minority oppressed population trying to escape from minority oppression. Right. The main problem with that, and this is a problem on both sides, is that both the Jewish faith as well as a lot of the Islamic faith are very location specific. They have specific locations that they view particularly holy. And that's why we have this crux of this location that they're both fighting over, because both of them have claims on this, and it is very important to their belief in faith. And right now, I mean, if you're looking in the present tense, you're correct in that the Israeli populace, the Israeli government, is definitely the major power in that region, very clearly the oppressor. But that wasn't the entire history.
Right, yeah. Yes.
They were an oppressed people originally. So you can still, I mean, there isn't that much cognitive dissonance between being a Goth, having empathy for an oppressed people. Depends on what snapshot of time you're looking at on whether you can view the Israelis as an oppressed population or not, because they started as one. The thing that always grieves me the most, and I see this within the scene and we've discussed it as well, is when an oppressed population gets a measure of control over some sort of a space. We talk about this around gatekeeping. When that oppressed population turns around, forgets what it's like to be oppressed, and takes advantage of their situation to become an oppressor, to kind of, it almost feels like a sort of vengeance on a nondescript, hey, I was oppressed, now I get to be an oppressor, let's revel in this. And I view that as particularly sad, but unfortunately particularly common human impulse.
Yeah, I agree with you, Trey.
That might be the result. When I mentioned Zionism, I mentioned Christian Zionism. That's really important to make a distinction that to be a Zionist, you don't even have to be Jewish. Like you have Joe Biden
plenty of
openly saying
Zionists.
he's Zionist, for example.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And most likely Donald Trump will be probably saying the same. I think the only differences between Biden and Trump in this regard is Trump might say it just to appease the fan base. He couldn't care less. Biden might be actually convinced of the idea.
Well, I mean, he did, like, when he was president, there were two things he did. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which is a big deal. And then he recognized Golan Heights as Israeli land, which was, not an agreed upon thing. And the Abraham Accords, he did that without Palestinian involvement as well. So, he definitely, there was a big push, I remember when he was in office, from Christian fundamentalists to do these kinds of things. And that's his base. So he was like, yeah, okay, whatever. Because he doesn't fucking know. He doesn't give a shit.
Yeah, he doesn't. He couldn't care less, clearly. Also, another point is like the most Orthodox of Jews, and there you always see them at the rallies. So it really has nothing to do with Zionism and Judaism are quite distinct. Zionism, though, is a movement that is well funded. And what they did was they took hold of many institutions. And unfortunately, they took hold of a lot of Jewish schools. And what they tried to do is they tried to indoctrinate people. That's the unfortunate part of things. So they're funding the schools, and instead of having like a religious school, you end up having a Zionist school. Also, the part that we mentioned, it was a really important prelude, the part that the pogroms in Eastern Europe that I had mentioned previously, is to humanize Jewish suffering. Because a lot of people who are, for example, pro-Palestine, and a lot of people who are pro-Israel will never humanize the other side. And that's a big problem. So it was important to note that, Jewish people were getting harassed and assaulted and beaten in a lot of places, Poland, Russia. And the Zionists latched onto that, and they played on that to try to tell them that, hey, you guys don't belong. You guys do not belong. And that's a malicious idea. So they want to tell all Jewish people that, hey, you American Jews, you're not American. You're Israelis. And I remember once Trump even referred to them as that.
They're all moving into the West Bank now.
Yeah, he kind of like othered all the Jews and then made it sound
Yeah.
like there's no American Jews. He made it sound like they're all Israelis and like, hey, I'm doing you
Right.
guys a favor in Israel, right?
Right.
As if every Jewish person here in the States is Israeli.
He's always doing
Um,
everybody a favor.
yeah, he's a big favors guy, and
Yeah.
everybody's his friend.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so that's another thing. I mean, on the topic of demographics, the Ottomans and the British, they both had statistics of what the land was like, before any of that happened. Like in 1899, the Ottoman census was in that piece of land there was 490,000 Muslims, 62,000
Mm.
Christians, and only 22,000 Jews.
Okay.
But that's very different than what you see today. By 1945, like a couple of years before Israel was established and all that, became 553,000. These are scary numbers. If you're
Yeah.
an indigenous person, you're living in that land, you're not talking about 100% increase in population. You're talking
Yeah.
about thousands of percents of increase. Once I read you some of the quotes that I prepared, you'll see why they were afraid, because a lot of the Zionists were quite open about, their intentions,
Mm.
attitude-wise, and all of that.
Well, you can get to that now if you want.
Wonderful. I mean, also you did mention the Hajj Amin Husseini bit, which is the revisionist Zionist the thing that Netanyahu did, where he blamed basically the Holocaust on who was basically a religious cleric in Jerusalem at the time.
Yeah.
But the explanation of that was that the Arabs had been occupied by the Brits for a few decades at that point. And so you could imagine in the indigenous population, if they're occupied by the empire, what's the first thing they want to do? They're going to go seek the enemies of that empire. Who are the enemies of the British? It was the Germans. And that's all it was about. They wanted to get rid of the British. So this guy worked with the Germans to get rid of the British. Zionists also worked with the Nazis. This is pre-Holocaust. This is before the Holocaust even happened. The Zionists worked with the Nazis to facilitate Jewish immigration, because the Zionists, and this is really well documented, all this stuff, they went up to the Nazis and they were like, okay, you don't want the Jewish people here, and we want them to move. We can work together. Obviously, that cooperation didn't continue when the Holocaust started, because they realized, okay, wait, maybe the Nazis are not our friends. For an Arab, and he also would probably blame them for blocking further Jewish immigration, because the Arabs tried to pressure the British to block Jewish immigration, because you saw the numbers. I just read you the numbers. It was crazy immigration, and nobody else was taking them. The Americans weren't taking them. They shut down their doors. The British weren't taking. Nobody was taking them. They were sending all of them to the Middle East, again, because a lot of these guys are closeted anti-Semites. So the Arabs weren't going to take more than a certain number, especially if that certain number began to openly proclaim that they're going to actually take over. And they would find shipments of smuggled weapons every now and then, and that would increase the fears of the Arab population. So analogies, I feel, are a really good way of explaining anything. Like if a beggar came to me for help while, let's say, declaring hostile intentions, I would think twice about helping him.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, the Arabs are terrible people for blocking Jewish immigration at one point, after decades of immigration, after decades of Jewish immigration. They blocked it at one point. I wouldn't say they're terrible, because there's a clear Zionist project, and we can move to the quotes, and that'll kind of like tie it all up together.
Yeah, let's do that.
So I have these written here, so I'm going to read them.
Yeah, please.
From the earliest of quotes, right? Because from the quotes you can understand everything. You can understand the attitudes. The context is really important for these. The Young Zionist organization, they were called the Bilu, quite revolutionary. They wrote to their fellow Jews a letter. This was in 1882. The vast majority of Jews that are like, are you asleep, O nation of ours? What have you been doing until 1882? Sleeping and dreaming the false dream of assimilation, meaning assimilating into Europe. Okay, so they're questioning these intentions, like you don't clearly belong in Europe. This is what they're telling their fellow Jews. Okay, and then they say, now thank God you have awakened from your slothful slumber. The pogroms have awakened you from your charmed sleep. So you see what was happening there.
Mm-hmm.
So they're telling their fellow Jews, hey, we clearly don't belong in Europe. They clearly don't want us. They're killing us all the time. And this is early signs of Zionism here from 1882. And they say, remember that you are a nation possessing a wise religion, a law, a constitution, a celestial temple whose wall is still silent witness to the glories of the past. Your state in the West is hopeless, as in Europe. The star of your future is gleaming in the East. And then they proposed to form a society. They called it the Bilu, after the house of Jacob. And they wrote, the seat of the committee will be Jerusalem. Donations and contributions shall be unfixed and unlimited. And then they list their demands. What we want. They say, a home in our country, meaning the land of Palestine. It was given to us by the mercy of God. It is ours as registered in the archives of history. So the main argument is biblical, right? Old Testament argument. And well, as you know, at the time, the Ottomans, the Turks were in charge. So they wrote, even if we have to beg it of the Sultan himself, right? So they're willing to work with the Turks to beg them for a piece of land there. And he says, and if it be possible to obtain this, to beg that we may at least possess it as a state within a larger state. The internal administration to be ours. Sounds like a Taiwan kind of scenario.
Sure.
Or Vatican, I don't know. To have our civil and political rights and to act with the Turkish Empire only in foreign affairs. So as to help our brother Ishmael in his time of need. Brother Ishmael means the Arabs, because the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. The Jews are descendants of Isaac, the sons of Abraham. So this is the sources, History of Zionism by Nahum Sokolow, Volume 2. So you see, this is quite interesting, right? Because this is really early, like signs of Zionism here.
Yeah.
And I'm working chronologically. I'm going to give you these quotes chronologically. These were in the 1800s. I'm going to give you one from the early 1900s. This is from 1907 by Dr. Arthur Rupin. He's one of the Zionist founders of Tel Aviv. Like, he founded the city. So he wrote in a letter to Jewish colonists, and basically he was talking about some observations he made in the early 1900s in a trip that he took to Palestine at the time. So he says, every study of present-day conditions in Palestine must use as a starting point the manner in which the 80,000 Jews of that country immigrated, beginning with the few thousand Sephardic Jews who were already to be found there a century ago. So here is already an admittance that it was only a few thousand Jews that were there, and the rest all came from somewhere else. Skip forward, he says, to all the foregoing must now be added a brief description of the Jewish colonies. So notice colonial language is very straightforward in early Zionist writings. They hide it now. Now you'll never hear this.
Yeah.
But back then it was trendy to be a colonizer because they're all from Europe, and all Europe did was colonize. So it was like it was the boss move, it's the thing to do. So he says the Jewish colonies, Jewish agricultural life. Let's see what he says about it. He says the colonies have been founded within the last 30 years and along two lines, some by young people who came out of Eastern Europe, bringing with them enthusiasm and industriousness, but little by the way of experience or economic resources. Others by the programmatic colonization work of Baron Rothschild.
Wow.
Okay, so there was an organization at the time by Baron Edmund Rothschild in 1923. It was founded. It was called the Jewish Colonization Association, or PICA. It's called the Jewish Organization Association. They literally called it that.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's
he says, yeah,
nuts.
I don't know. Any
Yeah.
comments about the name? It's a cool name.
That's fantastic. I love it. Yeah.
He says,
That's
our
wild.
position today is very different from what it would have been if we had to start our colonization work from the beginning. How important the colonies are is proved by the role which the 4 or 5 German colonies in the country play as centers of support for Germany. How much more important for the Jews are the 25 colonies which they can call their own. In contrast, now here's an important part. Listen to the attitude here. In contrast, the pitiful Arab villages with their huts of baked clay, the Jewish colonies with their wide streets, their strong stone houses, and their red tiled roofs look like veritable oases of culture.
Wow. Yeah. Dehumanizing, classism, racism. That's all right there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
So colonialism. They do not speak like there are people from that land or that they even remotely belong to that land.
Right. Yeah.
And by the way, we did mention that there were Eastern Jews, right?
Yep.
Like the Mizrahi and all of that. They didn't like these guys.
Right. Yeah.
They did not like them. Most of the immigration, they were trying their utmost effort to bring Jewish people from Eastern Europe. They couldn't care less about the Moroccan Jews. They couldn't care less about the Yemeni Jews. They did the least effort to get these guys because they wanted to establish it as predominant, because they were racist against their own, because Ashkenazi are pretty much white people compared to the Mizrahi, right? They view them as like brown Arab looking people who, right? The Arabs and the Eastern Jews, they understand each other more. They have a common language. They have very close cultures. They understand each other. Ashkenazi were foreigners, and Ashkenazi were in charge of Israel. They weren't getting a guy from Yemen to be in charge of Israel. They weren't getting a guy from Bahrain to be in charge of Israel. It was Eastern Europeans. And they were very racist against their own. The next one it's an American journalist called Vincent Sheehan. Okay? And this American, he was actually paid by Zionists in the late 1920s to travel to Palestine and write his observations. So I took a few, bits from here and there from his observations. So he writes, that was probably the first impression I received of walled Jerusalem in the early days. That it was an Arab city. It was as Arab as Cairo or Baghdad. And the Zionist Jews were as foreign to it as I was myself. That's what he wrote. He's on their payroll. But at least he's being honest. He's being like a journalistic integrity, I guess, whatever. So then he says, I no longer try to ignore the fact that Palestine was, by the overwhelming majority of its population, an Arab country. The Arabs for whom they had contempt as uncivilized race, to whom some of them referred to as Red Indians and others as savages, right?
Wow.
So that's what they were calling them. That's imagine having somebody as a guest in your country and they're referring to you.
Yeah, just straight up racist.
The whole thing makes me very nervous. What an exhibition of imbecility the whole thing is. And if it weren't for the British police, I think there would have been terrible pogroms. So you see, like when a Zionist would tell you, hey, well, the Arabs were attacking the Jews there, they're not giving you some of the details.
Well, that's what exact same thing that's happening now.
Yes, they're not giving you the details.
No.
There's a reason why the Arabs might have gotten so angry that they would attack their Jewish neighbors or whatever.
Yeah.
These guys were like driving around with their flags saying, this is ours. We're claiming it.
That happens now with the paramilitary groups there that are harassing like Palestinian civilians, and that those groups are getting money from the Israeli government, and the in the West Bank where they're existing peacefully, their homes are getting demolished to put in parking lots, and they're being killed, and harassed and thrown in jail. Like there's, I don't know, like thousands of people put in jail for really insignificant things, and it's just this effort to displace them, even though they're living there peacefully. It's not. It's an apartheid regime, basically.
Yeah. So ultimately, he concludes, like, this is his concluding paragraph. He says that the regime under which an Arab majority had to be governed without representation, until such time that a Jewish majority could be pumped into the country from abroad, was regulated by the Balfour Declaration and the mandate. So he's saying basically that they're putting a pause on creating any form of government until a significant number of Jewish people are pumped into the country so they can establish like a Jewish country. Otherwise, it would have just ended up being Palestine, as you would imagine it. So that's what's interesting about this quote, is that it's a neutral party. It's just his observation there on a day-to-day basis. They're quite lengthy diaries that were published.
That's really interesting.
Next guy is a Zionist founding father, modern day Israel. His name is Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Very Middle Eastern sounding, Vladimir. So on November 4th, 1923, he stated, again, this is 1923, like, way before any Holocausts or even World War II or any of that stuff. He says it is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestinian Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a Jewish country with a Jewish majority. He says, my readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all of the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. He says there is no such precedent.
No.
Again, see, the
That's
reason
kind of what that thing is.
He says, we may tell them, as in we may tell the Arabs, whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them palatable. But they know what we want, as well as we know what they do not want. They feel at least the same instinctive, jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico and the Sioux for the rolling prairies.
Wow. That's amazing.
Powerful, though. This is from the Jewish Virtual Library, by the way. This is their official library in Israel. Yeah, let's see how many more. I got just two small ones. Just so that it be an overkill, because I'm a fan of overkill. We're talking about video games, so
yeah.
Because you seal the door so that no one can argue. Joseph Weitz, against a very Middle Eastern name. He was the head of the Jewish Agency's colonization department in 1940. They had a colonization department.
Wow.
From a solution to the refugee problem. That's the name of the document. He says, between ourselves, he's talking to his people, Zionists that were probably there. It must be clear that there is no room for both peoples together in this country. This is now we're in the 1940s. We shall not achieve our goal if the Arabs are in this small country. There is no other way than to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries. All of them, not one village, not one tribe should be left.
Wow. But I mean, that's like that history of fascism is so important. Like you talk about the violence now. So, well, I guess another example would be the ANC, the African National Congress in apartheid South Africa, that were, violently resisting institutionalized racism. Because the thing is, you have this history of explicitly stated, racism and colonialism. And now a lot of the conversation, at least in, mainstream media, is about like, well, what about Hamas? What about Hamas? That kind of thing. And I think what happens is, if you look at the apartheid in South Africa, the problem is less the groups that were violently resisting that did kill some civilians, which of course is I don't agree with, obviously. But the problem is that kind of system is a violent system and will always generate violence because of you clearly the language being used is not one of peace and reconciliation or anything like that. And so you either are killed or you become a rebel. And so the issue now in the modern day world, it was Mike. There's that viral clip of Michael Brooks, who's a Jewish political commentator, talking about how there's one group who has all the power and acts on a population of people with total impunity. They're not held accountable. They're supported by by America and that kind of thing. And so it's not this symmetrical relationship. And so anti-colonial struggle is, there will be a lot of unnecessary violence, but the thing is that you have this group of people who are having atrocities committed against them, and they don't have any power. So even just from that, you're going to radicalize some people, because there's always going to be people that are like that in any population. But what Israel has done is destroy any kind of socialist movement, any kind of like peaceful protest. And so all you end up with is like violent retribution, which is again not symmetrical.
That's a really good point.
But you have there's, because Israel has the billions of dollars of weapons and technology from America, and the people in Gaza they don't have anything left. They're living in hell every day. They're starving. They're being bombed. And so when you grow up in and only know violence, and you only know military checkpoints and partitions and no autonomy, there's really no other option like to try and get that autonomy. So the issue isn't really the violence necessarily, even though clearly that's wrong. The issue is that the colonial system cuts off all other pathways to autonomy or peaceful existence or human rights, because it's from everything you've read, they aren't humans, they don't deserve to be there, whatever. And so then when you just inflict constant violence and trauma on people, then you end up in this situation. And if you removed that, you would remove the violence, because the violence is there because it has to be. Yeah, that's in. Oh, it was a lot. It was a water hose of fascism. You blasted off there in those quotes.
Yeah, that's the historical context, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do. I think you have a really good take, like a really good conclusion from all of those quotes. I mean, you summed up pretty much parts of it there, and a point that you raised, which is pretty important, is blocking the way towards diplomacy and blocking the way towards peace, which seems to be a prevalent tactic for a lot of terrible regimes in the Middle East.
Yeah.
For example, Syria, when the people of the Syrian Republic rebelled and protested against the dictatorship, which they have been under, was a father, and then his son inherited pretty much the throne, turning the republic to a dictatorship, almost a monarchy. It was widely popular and almost entirely peaceful. And what the president of Syria did was he opened the regime's prisons. He allowed literal extremist fundamentalist terrorists to flood outside of the prisons. And then those guys went and they created these crazy type of Islamist organized armed groups that took up arms. And so the rebellions of the protests turned from peaceful to violence.
Yeah.
And then he used that as an excuse to quell the entire protest. So like he looked at the West and he's like, see, if I lose control, if I lose power, these crazy Islamists are going to take over. And look, they've been violent, and we're gonna have to use extreme violence against them now. And he waged an all-out war against his own people, killing almost anywhere between 400,000 to like maybe 500,000 of his own people.
Ooh, yeah.
And now Netanyahu did the same thing. Netanyahu, as is proven, has been bolstering Hamas. Are you aware of this? It's become almost common knowledge now. Were you guys aware of that? That Netanyahu was funding Hamas?
Yeah, I'd seen a little bit about that.
Yeah, and he like here. I'm the king of quotes. I'm gonna get you quotes from. So this is from Ehud Barak, who is the former Israeli prime minister. He quotes Netanyahu as openly saying, "Whoever wants to avoid the threat of a two-state solution must support my policy of paying protection money to Hamas." Okay? Another Israeli prime minister, Ehud Olmert, he says, they, meaning Hamas, had no money. And the Palestinian Authority, which is in the West Bank, refused to give Hamas any money. Bibi, as in Netanyahu, saved them. Bibi made a deal with Qatar, and they started to move millions and millions of dollars to Gaza. So that's two Israeli prime ministers telling you that Netanyahu is funding Hamas. And the reason, according to him, what he said in a Likud party meeting in 2019, Netanyahu literally says, if you want to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, you need to support my plan of strengthening Hamas.
Right,
because
of course,
Hamas,
you need them to do something to point to and say, just like you said, like, oh, look, well, here's a reason to retaliate.
Yes, because first of all, they're branded as terrorists worldwide. Nobody takes them seriously. It's a religious group, right? Nobody takes them seriously. They keep the Palestinians divided, right? Because the PLO and the Palestinian Authority are in the West Bank.
Right, yeah.
Well, they can, whenever they demand a state, the Israelis are going to say, hey, well, you guys are divided. How about you guys come to an agreement among each other, and then we give you a state? They'll never come to an agreement because those guys are fanatics. You have fanatics, right, on one end, and a corrupt government on the other end. But so he does this intentionally, and I think there's a video clip by Netanyahu saying that we had no green light to invade Gaza or do any action against Hamas to eliminate Hamas until October 7th.
Yeah,
so they
he's
were
been wanting to forever.
Yes.
To bomb everything, get everybody out of there.
Yeah, the U.S. wasn't permitting it, but after October 7th, they got the green light.
Trey, anything you want to throw in there?
I mean, I could just do a general sum up, I guess. I mean, basically to reiterate what I said at the very beginning of this conversation, there is no good side of this conversation. There are, to a degree, people who are jockeying for power on both sides that are manipulating information, manipulating the situation for their own advantage. And then there are the victims. All of the people who are just caught in the crossfire. And that's the vast majority of the people that my heart reaches out to on both sides of this whole event, is the people who've just been caught in the crossfire. Both sides can lay claim to fairly legitimate justifications, and both sides are taking advantage of those to a degree to try to gain power. I mean, I've been watching this conflict for and there doesn't seem to be any light at the end of this tunnel. I don't know if there's a good solution to any of this. It's kind of a harrowing thing to discuss, a harrowing thing to think about, and to exist in a time when this is happening. Yeah, I mean it's at best an interesting way to reflect on life and the plight of the oppressed, and take some lessons on how to be and how not to be in the world, I guess. I don't know. Like, that's all I can really view from this. I mean, my heart goes out to the oppressed in almost all situations, but as I said before, it's not cut and dried black and white on who is the oppressed in the big picture of things. Only on the smaller scale can you point to clear oppressor and a clear oppressed. But
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, unconscionable acts are happening on both sides. Um, there are frankly no very fine people on any side here.
Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah, I just like to put the emphasis on the fact that despite, you know, like you could, because there is that narrative in the media of like, well, look, Hamas did these horrible things. Israel has a right to defend itself, but it is not a symmetrical situation.
Right.
There, you know, you shouldn't have to really compare numbers of like, well, how many people died on this side, how many, like, that's not even, I don't even think that's productive, but just the fact that
it's not, but it also doesn't look good on the Israel
yeah,
with that, because the vast majority of deaths, and well, maybe not vast majority, but definitely the majority of deaths and casualties are on the, of course, lesser armed, poorer side.
Right. But I mean, even just like,
the reason,
you know, the white phosphorus that Israel used, and the sort of like killing peaceful protesters and embargoing and blocking food and electricity, and the like malnutrition statistics in Gaza, and the fucking somebody in the IDF saying that, oh, we need to put Palestinians on a diet, or we're mowing the lawn is what they're calling, you know, bombing homes and things like that, destroying their farms and things.
Yeah, they've established genocidal intent. Yeah, they've established genocidal intent, and they're carrying out pretty much. But solution wise, is that's the tricky part. Like, where can we go from here, and all of that, and also like the stance on Hamas is a little bit confusing. Do we condemn, because they are technically, according to international law, they are occupied people? Do we condemn occupied people if they fought back? And what are legitimate means of fighting back versus illegitimate means of fighting back? Because Palestinians have tried a wide array of things. They've tried diplomacy, they've tried protests, they've tried, and also I don't want to simplify. Palestinians are like not one entity. They have very big disagreements of opinion on what's the best way to achieve success for their people and liberation for their people. Hamas is the group that chose the sign of the armed struggle path. And what they did is I would say when asked about it, I dislike it. I do not condone it. I can't condemn it. I find it really hard to condemn it. Because why? Because if I was living in Gaza, if my parents were kicked out of their home in front of my eyes, and my neighbors were shot and killed, and my cousins were bombed, and I was starved, and all of these injustices were done to me, who knows what I would have done? I would have probably done worse than Hamas. So who am I to really condemn them for taking? I don't think I would have taken hostages, honestly. If that had happened to me, like sometimes you're walking in a street, right? And somebody looks at you the wrong way. It's like, yeah, what's up with that guy? And that's like a minor offense. Somebody just gave you like a look. Like, why is this guy judging me? And you get like offended and upset. Imagine something way worse than that happening to you. Would you be able to really think rationally and diplomatically and peacefully? I think Palestinians have, in general, throughout their history, shown that they're able to really hold it together. If chosen people is a title, I would give them that title, because it takes a lot of patience and perseverance and endurance to deal with decades of this without a slither of hope, and like all of their diplomatic efforts are blocked every time the United Nations votes on a Palestinian state. Everybody votes in favor. The U.S. vetoes it.
Yeah.
And Micronesia, a tiny island somewhere, they also veto it. But it's clear that there is no intentions. The people who hold the most power in this struggle, they have zero intentions of a peaceful solution or a solution at all. It's either status quo or even further tyranny, further oppression towards the Palestinians. A solution obviously would not be something like, hey, let's throw the Israelis in the ocean. That's not a solution.
No.
But a solution also isn't, let's keep these Palestinians in refugee camps all
Yeah.
over, foreign countries. Let's have them brought back to their country. The same way I don't think the Palestinians are asking for much probably at this point. I think they could get whatever they can get their hands on, they'll take. I think they're really, really desperate. And
like I think in some cases they're not even allowed to like fish. Like, and they live right next to the sea, and Israel like bans fishing in certain areas, certain times.
Yeah, shepherds, fishermen, they all get attacked and harassed. The farmers get their fields burned. There's a ton of that online. That's not something that I can add anything to because there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for it. That's just crazy, the amount of documentation for the injustice that is happening there. Maybe the historical stuff, yeah, a little bit harder to dig out from here and there. But there has to be a solution which, like for me, the dissolution of the state of Israel is important. Why? Because in the 21st century, you can't have an ethno-state.
No.
If it was Muslim, I would have the same opinion. If it was Christian, I would have the same opinion. Nothing to do with it being a Jewish state. You can't have a state that prefers or is clearly apartheid. You can't have that in the 21st century. So even if they do split into two states, it's still Israel.
It's not.
The form of government, the system of government has to change. You can't have like second-class citizens. No. At least not openly in the Constitution, because it is pretty open, like in their laws. A lot of that stuff is openly coded into laws. Here in the States, we have some of that stuff, but they're a bit sly with how they introduce it, right?
Yeah. Like
over there, it's in the open. They're like, okay, this is a Jewish-only road. Only Jews can take this highway. Palestinians have to go through like 7 checkpoints.
Mm-hmm.
If a Palestinian woman is pregnant, tough luck. You're not granted a pass, so you can't go. You can't reach the hospital. You give birth at the checkpoint. Usually they die. So they're doing this in the open. I don't know what to tell you. Like as far as Goths, at least I can tell you, there's a lot of Jewish people in alternative culture.
Yeah.
Jewish people have always been very, very creative, very driven. And it could be that a part of what they suffered through had pushed them to go and find these different ways and different types of lifestyles where they can express a lot of what they need to express. I know a lot of Goths in the alternative scene. Only one of them is pro-Israeli. And that's because the person is, I think, in his 50s and his parents live in Israel. So the 50s, it's harder in the older generation to find people that are more, but all of the young Goths that I know are very pro-Palestine. Some of them are actually outspoken about it. But it's
I ran into 3 people I had arguments with, which was wild to me that was a thing that was even, and they were young. And I was like, what is happening here? But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's just, you can protest, you can talk about it, you can raise awareness, you can look and read about it. And I just, I feel like this specific event has impacted a lot of, at least my friends in the goth scene, in more direct ways than other atrocities and things like that have happened. And so I don't know. I like, as to your point, I do see a lot of younger goths, especially people getting into goth, talking a lot about the politics of it in some way. Like, well, you can. There's whole arguments about, can you be a Republican and goth or not? Like, what are the values and the ethos of that? And that wasn't something that ever really happened from when I got into goth around 2003 or whatever forward. That wasn't really a conversation that happened. And so it is nice to see. Goth does make such beautiful art, that's really moving for I was going to say for the soul. I don't necessarily believe in a soul, but moving in a ontological, metaphysical way. And I think that itself is political, but there's also more direct things that are impacting us in America and across the world. That is just like, I think sometimes we just need to take time to look at this stuff and think about it, and the way it relates to us and what we can do. And I know in Chicago, it's also nice to know that a lot of the scene there are activists in some way. I know like veganism is has always been a really popular activist angle for goths, but in a lot of different ways, I've seen people out there protesting, and even Sarah but Sarah and William are outspoken proponents for various issues, and they're sort of the king and queen of the Chicago goth scene. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
no, it makes sense. Yeah, there is activism. There's a lot of people. I think obviously the internet and just how connected people are has a big role to play in it. Because before that, I would suppose it's harder. Like Palestine is trending on TikTok, so
right, yeah.
That's where most of the young people are, and so that's how a lot of them know about it. So
it's not a great way to know about it.
Yeah, yeah.
It's good that there is knowledge happening.
At least they know something's there.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, honestly, I think that was one of the arguments put forth about why the Congress was so bent on banning TikTok rather than any of these other mega corporations, because TikTok has become this way of getting footage. Like, I've seen footage from Gazans in Gaza talking about what's going on that I would literally not see anywhere else. And I think that undermines the sort of political maneuvering and control of popular opinion that is a threat in a way. Not that TikTok's this bastion of free speech or anything. There's all kinds of problems with social media, but there is good to it, at least.
Yeah, anybody could post anything. It's like Wikipedia in a sort. It's like not an academic source. It's not but
yeah.
It does shed light. Like it will have a focus on a topic. So I think also Dusty from Vision Video, he was having an argument while on stage with a Zionist not long ago, maybe last month. They posted
amazing.
A video of that. It's pretty interesting.
I've seen him speak out. I think he spoke out when I saw him in. Where did I see him last? Saw him recently.
Well, we saw him together. I don't know if you saw him after that.
It was after that. It was after that. No, it was this year.
Okay. He's constantly on tour, it seems like.
Oh, it was. He opened for Voltaire.
Oh yeah.
So that's why I saw him, and he did speak out about the whole situation then as well.
I love Dusty both because he's an incredible person. Like, we don't have a close relationship, but he has randomly sent, like when I've been struggling with some financial issues, he's randomly privately sent me some money to help out. But I was talking with my friends Azzy and Ryan about this because I thought it was interesting how popular he's become just as like a personality. He's got a huge following, and they brought up how cool it is that somebody in the scene who's very outspoken and a leftist and knowledgeable has become so popular and has gotten this platform. And I think it just sort of speaks to the shift in the focus of the goth community in a really good way.
Yeah, Dusty's kind of spearheading it in a sense. Speaking of TikTok, that's how I found out about Vision Video in the first place. Because one of the biggest factors in Vision Videos becoming popular is the Goth Dad persona.
Goth Dad, yeah.
And that spread like wildfire on TikTok. And that's how I knew. I knew about that before I knew that there was a band called, let's say, Vision Video or anything like that. And I think that's how most people found it. So they made good use of that platform.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I have I have all these other questions about all these other things, but I don't think I have any time left. So
probably not. And you have
because genuinely I really appreciate the knowledge, the level of knowledge and intellectualism that you brought to this conversation, because I love that kind of stuff. Like, history isn't my area of expertise. I'm more into like philosophy and sociology. And we've done episodes that are very hyper specific on sort of more academic, cerebral looks at an area of philosophy or something that I think is important. And I always love having people on that have the level of expertise that you have. So that's really been great. And I would love to get into your expertise about music as well. I think I'm going to have to try and figure out a way to get you in on a music episode or something, like an album review episode or something. But yeah, I think I think I'm going to have to wrap everything up here. So
it makes sense, because it's a lot for anybody who's listening. That's a lot of also information to process, and it'll be a weird jump from such a dreadful like political topic like back into let's talk about twin tribes or something.
Yeah.
It'll be wild. So
I don't know if you want to share your like social media or anything in that vein that you would want people to check out.
I mean, whoever wants to find me, I think I'm probably the only goth with the first name Hani, Hani. So if you type that and Von Gehenna, you will get none other than me. And I'm sure we'll have somebody in common, because I have a lot of people in common with everyone at this point.
Yeah, or if you ever come to Chicago, you'll find him, or he'll find you.
Yeah,
one of those.
You just got to go to the front row. That's where you'll find me. I won't be anywhere in the back.
Yeah. All right. Well, Hani, again, it was amazing getting to hang out with you, and I appreciate you spending time with us.
Yeah. Thank you guys for
yes, thank you.
Yeah, the platform, and to speak about something that you don't usually talk about in a goth podcast, or not something. I mean, this is for all goth in a sense, or at least we could claim the title.
Yeah.
It's not something that's generally spoken about, like international politics.
Right.
Goth episodes tend to be mostly about philosophy, and things like that. How to the morbidity of certain things and the beauty in that. And that might have been actually one of the first episodes I saw of Cemetery Confessions. I was like, wow, this person is really well spoken. This is definitely a philosophy major, because no regular podcast host uses like this kind of like language, this kind of vocabulary. It's very, very expert vocabulary. Let's say.
I appreciate that. I think I'm looking forward to the comments on this episode because even just in passing, our last episode, one of our guests who lives in Italy mentioned that there's an issue with fascism in Europe. And we had somebody commenting saying that that's just American brain rot, and it's ridiculous to say that there's a fascism problem in Europe. And which is fucking hilarious. But I'm sure
I am morbidly curious.
There is
definitely see where these go.
There is because our friends from there's a local kind of noise band, Hyde.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know Heather. So
I know who that is. I don't know
they went
Heather
touring.
personally.
Heather is Egyptian. I think. I heard at least Arab, as far as I'm aware.
Mm-hmm.
But Heather went touring, and Heather played Germany with the band Hyde, and they were prevented by Germany's punk rock collective from hanging a Palestinian flag on stage.
Wow.
From what I understand, there's a big
Wow.
schism or big split in the punk rock collective there. I guess one part is bootlickers and one part is actually rebellious people. But yeah, something's going on in Europe, and we're not there to find out what it is. Unfortunately, we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I just saw the news. I see the news about the far right party in France that's getting a lot of traction right now, and just how more like Macron is going to the right. Anyway, it just it's not really. We don't need to talk about it, but it's going to be fun moderating the comments on this episode.
Make sure to link me to the comments. I want to read it just for fun.
Yeah, it's usually most of the comments come in on YouTube, because that's really the only place. If you listen on a podcast app, which most people do, you can't. There's nowhere to comment, so it's usually YouTube that people show up to.
There will be bots, I'm sure, as well. Like there'll be bots, because I know they're employing bots now.
Just
the Hasbro and
keywords.
whatnot. Like it'll leave a generic pro or anti comment for whatever topic. They buy those out.
Trey, it was funny just thinking about comments again, because we did that episode about, I mean, to be fair, I made a clickbait title just for the fact of like trying to get more views, but the millennials versus Gen Z, who's the better goth.
Yeah.
And so then there were people who clearly didn't listen to it, saying things about how, or aren't familiar with the show. Like how could you leave boomers and Gen X out of this conversation, because they're the ones who made goth. They're the best goths. Gen X is, everybody forgets Gen X or whatever. And I'm like, and you're forgetting that one of them is on the podcast and you clearly didn't listen to it. But I don't know. Those are always amusing.
Yeah, that's a fiery debate for sure. Anything to do with like Gen X or Gen Z versus millennials ends up being fiery.
People get really tribal.
I think we shouldn't pit them against each other.
No.
It's a good idea.
And that wasn't even the episode. It was just, sometimes I experiment with more clickbait titles just to see what happens. But yeah.
That's all it takes, the title. They're going to respond to the title, not to the content.
Yeah. Well, that certainly was a unique episode. I do enjoy little experiments like this from time to time. Our next episode, though, we will be back to the regularly scheduled programming. It will be a return of our Facing Nostalgia series, where myself, Trey, Azzy Bats of Obscura Undead, and Ryan of the band Witch Hands pick an album from our Baby Bat days, revisit it, and discuss whether or not it holds up to our adult sensibilities. I want to thank you for sticking with us to the end of this episode. I hope to see you on the next one. But until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of the Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.